Okay, I promised you a video on how to consume our Shark API and get some data from it. So I'm going to do that now. I'm doing this on my deck, so if you hear the screeching of sulfur-crested cockatoos or aeroplanes going over, you'll be able to ignore those. So all I've done here is I've gone to our latest set of data on the website and I've hit the data API and it's brought me into this and given me some example queries. Now, if you're looking for something that is past the last date in your database, you'd probably look at using this SQL statement down the bottom here, where you can actually write an SQL where date greater than the last date in your database. But for today, I've just used this. I've clicked on that and got the data. That data I've placed into VS Code, and I've just prettified it. There's a plugin you can get called Prettier, and it'll allow you to make your code prettier. And so when it's pretty, you can actually see how the data is laid out quite nicely. Now, we're keenly interested in these records, aren't we? So that's an array, but record sits inside result, inside the object we get back. So we're getting a single object back. Inside that is a field called results, so that's dot result. And inside that is an array field called records. And inside that are the pieces of data, the individual pieces of data for each citing each record. Now, just for the sake of today's tutorial, I'm just going to use date, area, location, and comma name of the shark. You can put the rest up, but it just means more typing. So I'm going to do that way. I've created myself an index.html and used Emmet to flesh it out. Just changed document to async await fetch API test. And I've also copied in the URL for that particular API call, just so I can use it a little later on. All right. First thing I need to do is to put somewhere to output the data. So I'm going to go outDiv to make a div that's classed as outDiv. There's a couple of techniques in here today that I'm going to use that are a little bit new. I've just started using them myself, so I'll show you what they are as we go along. Next, I'm going to put a script tag in at the bottom of my page. Don't forget this is the new standard. Put your scripts right before the end of the body. Technically, you can actually put them outside the HTML, but the browser support for that is a little dodgy in some browsers, so it's best just to put it before your /body. And we're going to create an asynchronous function. So the way we create those now is to call them a constant, give it a name, like load data equals. Now, to create an asynchronous, we simply use the keyword async before the brackets, and then we write the body of our function. The first part of that is we're going to need to call our API. So I'm going to go up and I'm going to copy this for use in a moment. Just get the API address out. And what we're going to do is we're going to define a constant called response. So it's the response we get back. We're wanting to store somewhere. And we have to await the fetch. And this is where our URL goes. Now, I did forget to put single brackets around that, so I'll just go fix that. Single brackets, done. Now, once we have a response, so await actually returns a promise. I'll let you go and figure out what promises are, but they're just an object in JavaScript that is asynchronous, that it promises to give you something back. Now, the promise may fail, but 9 times out of 10, if you're using known API endpoints, etc., it's not going to fail unless the server's down. So we are fairly assured that we're going to get a response in a while. And when we actually have a look at this page, you're going to see that it does take a little while to get that response back. So that's why we're using async and await, which is the newest way to do this sort of stuff. All right, so once we've got a response, what we need to do is draw out the data from it. So I'll just call that data, for lack of a better term. And again, we have to await, because what we actually get back from the API call in the fetch is another promise. So we need to, when I can spell it correctly, and we want to actually take that as JSON. Okay. All that's left to do is to actually return something from this function. So I'm going to return the data, but I'm going to return the data, but I'm going to return the data's result. Remember that the records are contained in a thing called result. So I'm just going to return the result, then we can access the records directly. Just to see what's happening, we need to actually get this thing running. So outside of that function, this is something new that I've only just started playing around with myself. What we need to do is to add to this document an event listener. Now what we are listening for is the event called DOM content loaded. Now that event gets called once the entire page has been loaded into the browser. So that means once we're all loaded, everything's up, everything's ready, then we're going to run our load data function. Now it's not just as simple as saying load data, this is also an asynchronous call. And what I'm doing now is I'm just writing a function directly. We never need to refer to this function. It's called an anonymous function. So we don't actually need to give it a name. It just means when the content's loaded, run this function. Okay. If I needed to run it in more than one place, then I would give it a name, and that way you can call it in more than one place. Now I'm going to set up a couple of variables. The first one's going to be data. I'm going to set it to be null. Now this data is different to this data. This data starts here and ends here at the end of this function. This data starts here and ends here at the end of this anonymous function. So this data and this data are two separate objects. It's about the scope of variables, the scope of objects. Okay, I'm also going to get a handle on that div above, and this is something new. I'm going to call it out div, and I'm going to use document.query selector. Now what this enables me to do is to get the first element that is classed as out div. Why classed? Because I'm using dots. If I'd have made this an ID equals out div, I could have used a hash there to get the thing ID'd as out div. So this selector is exactly the same selector that CSS uses. So if I want to style this in my CSS, I would say .outDiv and then give it a border, give it a background color, etc., etc. It's exactly the same for here. Now if you've got multiple outDiv elements, which you can because they're classes, it will only return the first one it comes to. That's very important. Alright, so we just want a handle on that, so we're going to use outDiv to actually output our stuff. Now it's time to call our function above. However, we can't just directly call it because it may throw an error. Because it's asynchronous, things might happen. So what I'm going to do, we haven't talked about this much in class, but we're going to put it inside a try-catch block. Now these are really handy because you can try something, and if there's an error, you can catch that error and deal with it neatly. So let's say that we got an error. What we can simply do is, and the easiest thing to do is just to console log that error. Or if you want to make it a little tidier, you can just console log the error message alone. So now we're dealing with our error, no problem at all. What do we do in the try? Well, that's easy. We've got this variable here called data, so let's make that data equal load data, and that simply loads our data. Now we do have a problem because we're waiting for responses here, and this is asynchronous. We also made this anonymous function asynchronous, and we can't just say, hey, load data. We need to await a response on load data as well. So we wait here, and we wait here. At that point, we've actually got our raw data. Our raw data is data.result, and because it's .result, we can go ahead and start parsing through that data. So what I'm going to do is say data.records, don't forget to get to that array, and we're going to map it. And each time we go through, we're going to call this thing a record. And we're going to do some things with it. For starters, let's simply go outdiv dot inner HTML plus equals record dot date. Now you'll notice I've put a capital letter D for date simply because over here they've used capital letters. They've done the same for area, location and common name. Camel case but capital letters. So I'm going to do the same over here. We're going to do that. Probably add a single quotes. Probably add a break to the end of the line. This is HTML. So we want date. Let's do area. Let's do location. And finally, let's do the common name of the shark. Now, I'm going to also double up this last break so that we get a blank line between each record. Okay, so first thing to do is to declare load data as an asynchronous function. We await our fetch, and put it into response. We convert that response into a JSON response, but we still have to await that because we had to await this. Once we've got that in data, we can then return its result, which was one of the fields. Once we return the result, which by the way is a complex object that has metadata here and then the records, we bring that data in as data in this function. Oh, this is an anonymous function. And all we're doing, if we get an error, we're going to log that error. We might try and simulate an error in a minute. All we're doing then is adding the date, the area, the location, the common name over to our outdiv. Alright, let's see how we go. We're going to open this with live server because this will work with live server. Alright, since we're not getting a response, let's go and have a look at what's happening in the console. Okay, evaluating data record.maps. I can see already what my problem is. I'll jump back over to here. They're records, and I have said record. And there we go. So, date, area, location, common name. And of course, if I go back and I change anything about that, like instead of limit 10, let's go limit 5, let's go limit 10. You see that wait while we're waiting for that data to come, and beautiful. Right, one last thing I probably will show you. We'll just put it back to 5 so it's just a single page. One last thing I will show you is this date. So the date format is quite clumsy. It's in an ISO standard date format with the T separator, etc, etc, etc. If we just want, and you'll notice they're not even recording time, so if we just want the date on its own and format it in a way that's useful, what we can do is we can, instead of going record date, before we do that, let's make a new date. Let's call it the date. And you can actually make it a new date object. JavaScript has a date object, and we'll call it record.date. And then we'll need a string. Let's call it, I don't know, date string. Need a string to actually pull the month and the year and the date and everything together. So we have this thing called the date, and they have methods called get date. So that will give us from 1 to 31. we're going to tack onto the end of that a slash, which is what we use as a separator. We're going to tack onto the end of that the date dot get month. Now I know this isn't going to be correct, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We'll put our separator there, and then the date dot get full year. We can get a shortened version if we want, but that should do it. Now don't forget, in JavaScript we can do things like this. We don't have to actually put all that on the same line. We can, maybe here would be a good place. So it's just that little bit more readable. Okay, so that should work, and what we need to do then is not output record.date, but output date string. Let's save that and see what we get. Looks to me like we get an error. I thought I fixed that. Oh, we can't do that there. We have to do that inside here, because it doesn't know what record is yet. So we'll do that there like that. Tidy it up. So that has to be done on each record, of course, inside the map. And now we get what looks like a reasonable date. The only problem is the month is actually incorrect. So month, if you have a look at the documentation, get month actually returns an index from 0 to 11. Don't know why it wouldn't just return the month number. However, what we can do is we can just add 1 to that. If I do that, it's just going to put a 1 on the end, which isn't what we want. 61st month. What I need to do is actually turn that into maths by simply saying evaluate the value of that for me. And now that's the 7th month, which is the actual correct month, not indexed. So there we go. I've been doing this on my website. So if you browse across to lordstech.online, you'll see a button at the bottom about the API test. Click on that, and this actual live code is sitting there ready for you to try. Hope that helps.